object is thus from now on the syllogism, which has for its extremes the inner being of things and the understanding, and for its middle term appearance. But the movement of this syllogism yields the further determination of what the understanding descries in this inner world through the middle term, and the experience from which understanding learns about the close-linked unity of these terms. Paragraph 145 might seem a little puzzling at first when you see Hegel talking about this term, the syllogism. That's a term that's used in logic, and it's good to remember that Hegel is engaged in something that is logical, but it's in a rather different sense than the kinds of logics that we tend to teach in, say, a logic course, which tend to be either Aristotelian logic or what we nowadays call modern formal logic. We don't generally teach any dialectical logic, and even the dialectical logic that Marxists like to work with isn't quite the same thing as Hegel's understanding of logic. Now, I'm going to say something else that takes us a little bit outside of the phenomenology as well, and that's Hegel. He does talk about this in the preface to the phenomenology. He says that the phenomenology itself, when it's fully articulated, is providing us with a logic, with a logos, a logike, of reality as such, right? Even encompassing the thinker, the conscious person within that reality. So he's going to write two other works later on that are called logics. One is not long after the phenomenology, and it is called The Science of Logic. That's a very long, dense work. Not as much people giving attention to that these days in comparison to the phenomenology in the 20th and 21st century, but it's well worth reading. And he will say some things about syllogism in that work that I'm going to bring up in just a moment that will help you give it some context. The other thing that he talks about as being a logic is what's referred to as the Encyclopaedia Logic, and that is where he's sort of laying out his entire system within a pretty schematic form in many respects, and that also, you might say, interfaces with the Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, going back to the Science of Logic, Hegel will say in the section that he devotes to the syllogism, because he has a whole discussion of the syllogism there, that the syllogism is, you might say, the eminent device of rationality, that judgments by themselves, concepts by themselves, the play of appearance by itself is not yet fully rational, and anything that is rational will, in some respect, be a syllogism. So right there, that ought to put you on your guard against thinking something like this when we hear syllogism. We've gotten conditioned, those of us who, say, teach logic or who've taken logic classes, to thinking that the term syllogism necessarily refers to, an argument that is articulated using three terms, a predicate subject with copula, that is in between, that we can represent with Venn diagrams or stuff like that. And syllogism in its classic sense, the way that Aristotle actually uses the term, outside of, say, the two analytics, in his broader work in the topics and the rhetoric and stuff like that, when he's talking about syllogizing or syllogismus, what he means there is a connected chain of reasoning that is bringing things together and has some sort of middle term which allows us to connect things, to see into things, to see the relations between things. So he'll talk about syllogizing as something, for example, that the rhetor is particularly good at doing. And it can even be connected with metaphor, and that's productive activity. Hegel is viewing it like that. So if, usually when we talk about a syllogism, we mean that there's two terms, and those are the premises, and this term one is related to the middle term in some way, term two is related to the middle term in some way, and then what we get as our conclusion is term one is connected with term one in some way. They don't always have to be in this order as far as, like this way, but they do have to be in order this way. And what's important is that the middle term, you might say, drops out, right? So the middle term is not there in the conclusion. Hegel, in discussing this, is not presuming that the syllogism works just that way. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't make any sense to talk about, things totally dropping out or disappearing and just having the conclusion. Instead, he's going to say, our object, right, what it is that we're studying, is thus from now on the syllogism, which has for its extremes, so here's the two extremes, extreme 1, extreme 2, those would be corresponding to term 1 and term 2 over there. The two extremes are the inner being of things, right, what we've been looking at in these previous passages, what's being mediated by appearance or the play of forces, right, and the understanding. So we've got the understanding and the inner being of things as the two extremes, and what's mediating them is appearance. Now, why is it a syllogism? Because there is a process of rationality. We just saw that reason now is coming on the scene, and rationality is taking part within this framework, within this dynamic relation. So he says the movement of this syllogism, notice, movement of this syllogism yields the further determination, it's going to show us some things, the further determination of what the understanding finds in this inner world, right? The understanding through appearance is finding something out about the inner world. And in relation to that, the experience from which understanding learns about the close linked unity of these terms. So understanding itself is accomplishing something in its work going through appearance to the inner being of things. Understanding is grasping something not only about the inner being of things, but also about itself. That is actually taking understanding from the level of just understanding to the level of rationality that we looked at just in the last section. The inner world is, for consciousness, still a pure beyond, because consciousness does not as yet find itself in it. It is empty, for it is merely the nothingness of appearance, and positively the simple or unitary universal. This mode of the inner being of things finds ready acceptance by those who say that the inner being of things is unknowable. But another reason for this would have to be given. Certainly we have no knowledge of this inner world as it is here in its immediacy, but not because reason is too short-sighted or is limited, or however one else likes to call it. On this point we know nothing as yet because we have not yet gone deep enough. But because of the simple nature of the matter at hand, that is to say, because in the void nothing is known or expressed from the other side, just because this inner world is determined as the beyond of consciousness. The result is, of course, the same as if a blind man is placed amid the wealth of the supersensible world, if it has such wealth, whether it be its own peculiar content, or whether consciousness itself be this content. And if one with sight is placed in pure darkness, or if you like, in pure light, just supposing this supersensible world to be like this. The man with sight sees as little in that pure light as in pure darkness, and just as much as the blind man in the abundant wealth which lies before him. If no further significance attached to the inner world and to our close link with it through the world of appearance, then nothing would be left to us but to stop at the world of appearance. That is, to perceive something as true which we know is not true. Or in order that there may be something in the void which, though it first came about as devoid of objective things, must, however, as empty in itself, be taken as also void of all spiritual relationships and distinctions of consciousness as consciousness, qua consciousness, in order then that in this complete void, which is even called the Holy of Holies, there may yet be something. We must fill it up with reveries, appearances, produced by consciousness itself. It would have to be content with being treated so badly, for it would not deserve anything better, since even reveries are better than its own emptiness. So if section 146 is supposed to be a syllogism in some sort of, classic Aristotelian sense of the term, or even the modern logic sense of the term, you're going to have a very difficult time trying to figure out how to cram it into all of that. Instead, what we have to see is the relationship between, again, the two extreme terms, the consciousness or the understanding, in this case also reason, and this inner world. And what we're going to see happening in this particular paragraph is consciousness being told, you need to do a bit more work. You need to work a bit harder before you say anything about what's in there. Next section is going to give us some clues about that, but we want to see the problematic that Hegel's laying out here. So he says, the inner world for consciousness is still a pure beyond. We don't yet know what the in itself of things holds for us. Consciousness, why, doesn't find itself in it. Consciousness is actually there in it, as we've seen in previous paragraphs, but it has not realized yet that it is there. So it's going to try to explore a bit on its own part what could be in there, and it's going to come up with some, as Hegel's going to put it, not quite in those terms, but let's call a spade, some crazy speculations about what's in there. So he says it's empty, for it's merely the nothingness of appearance. We've got appearance here, what we can grasp, what we can make sense of, it's objective for us. And then we have this beyond, this inner world, which could be the supersensible world that we were talking about just 2 paragraphs before as well. We have the world of appearance, the phenomenal world, and then we have, let's just come out and say it, Kant's noumenal world, right? The world that we can think but can't really know. The world in which we can perhaps engage by action, by willing, but about which we can have no reliable representations. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done in a Kantian way, although Hegel is sort of, platforming off of that in this case. It could be any case where we're saying there's some sort of world beyond, there's something beyond the appearances, but we can't really figure out what it is. And why not? That's the key question here. He says, this mode of inner being of things finds ready acceptance by those who say the inner being of things is unknowable. So it's going to appeal to people who are, involved in critical philosophy. It's going to appeal to people who are, when it comes to science, not the people who are the big believers in science will solve anything, but the people who actually understand the limits of science, that it's restricted essentially to the phenomenal world and what we can conclude from it. It's also going to appeal to people who have a kind of certain kind of mystic tendency, who want to say, there's just some unknowable, unsayable thing beyond that we can't really get at. Let's just call it the void, because that's what Hegel's going to call it. And there's people who do that. We've already seen Hegel's criticisms of them in the preface. He says another reason would need to be given. He's not going to accept that sort of reasoning. Why not? How do you know there's a void in there? Who told you that there's something like that? What do you actually mean by it if you can't conceive of it, if you can't say it? This is one of the problems with anybody who wants to make a recourse to that sort of mysticism. Mysticism meaning, the dealing with the mystery, that which is hidden, that which is concealed. Hegel would say, look, unless you can unconceal it a little bit, you have no idea what's there. And you probably ought to keep your mouth shut, He probably would be willing to say, hey, if you want to be Tractatus Wittgenstein and say that thereof we cannot speak, we have to be silent, you go on ahead. But don't expect anybody else to be silent, and don't think that I'm going to be silent as a result, because I actually have some confidence in the power of reason. I'm not going to accept the limits that have been placed on it, because those limits themselves, seemingly coming from reason, are themselves actually not fully rational. So he says, certainly we don't have any knowledge of this inner world as it is here in its immediacy. But not because reason is too short-sighted, not because reason is itself too limited. As we're going to see, Hegel often will say, when there's a limit in place, how do you know that limit is in place? You have to already be beyond the limit to a certain extent in order to see the limit there. You have to implicitly transgress the limit to observe the limit. And Hegel says the same thing about reason. He says, on this point we know nothing as yet because we have not yet gone deep enough. Not because reason is totally incapable, but because the people who have used reason up till this point have not gone far enough with it. Or perhaps if there are some who have gone far enough with it, Hegel certainly thinks that there are some people like this, we haven't actually paid attention to them and taken into account what they had to tell us, perhaps in part because it would have required a lot of work on our part to get to where they were able to take reason. Reason is not something that you're given once and for all, like a toolbox or, a package of candies. Instead, it's something, think of it like a muscle that works upon itself that has to develop itself through the very activity of working. So he says, the simple nature of the matter in hand, that is to say, because in the void nothing is known or expressed from the other side, just because this inner world is determined as beyond of consciousness. We have decided or arrived at the point where we say, look, I don't know what's there. Let's just call it the X or the null set or the empty. We don't really know. We have to work in order to get there. And so he says, the result, if we want to make a comparison, is just the same as if a blind man is placed amid the wealth of the supersensible world. If it has such wealth, whether it be its own peculiar content or whether consciousness itself be this content, and if one with sight is placed in pure darkness, or if you like, in pure light. When we have pure darkness, of course, you can't see anything. When we have light that is sufficiently bright, we can't see anything either. This, by the way, is a metaphor that goes all the way back in time to the great ancient and medieval thinkers. St. Anselm talks about the metaphor of our view on the divine as not being that the divine is itself obscure or dark, but rather that it is so bright, it is so blinding. The inaccessible light in which God dwells is one that we are not capable of seeing through, in part because there's a superabundance of intelligibility, a superabundance of content, a superabundance of illumination. So he compares us to owls, or he actually compares the dialecticians to owls who think that, because they can't really see in sunlight, there's nothing there to see. Hegel's saying the same thing about this. He goes on and he says, the man with sight sees as little in the pure light as in pure darkness. So, it could be that it's a void. It could be that it's a wealth of content that we're just not able to process. We're just not able to take in. We're not able to make intelligible for ourselves on this end. At least not yet. Later on, we actually will. But that takes development. That takes process. That takes building. That takes Bildung, education or formation, right? So he's going to go on and he says, if no further significance attached to the inner world and our close link with it through the world of appearance, if we weren't able to get to it through appearance, as we're going to see talked about in the next paragraph, then nothing would be left but to stop at the world of appearance. We could say, all right, there's a limit here. We can't get beyond that. There may be something beyond that, but we're just going to observe that and say, that stuff over there, that's not for us. Human beings should think human thoughts and not divine thoughts, right? We leave that part over there. But what would be the consequence if we were to do that? We would live a life that would, in some respects, be alienated from what is most important. Or we wouldn't even know whether it's most important because we wouldn't have gotten over here to see what's actually there. This is not just, wanderlust, wanting to see what's over the next mountain pass. This is wanting to see what is under all the mountains altogether. For Hegel, this is, you could say, and this is not something that's in the text, but this is sort of the prototypical Enlightenment idea, if indeed we take Kant's sapere aude, dare to know. Not just dare to think, not just dare to say, but dare to know, to taste. to be wise about things, Hegel is saying, yes, that's exactly what we should do. So he says, or in order that there may be something in the void. If we don't just observe this limit and say, nothing we can say about that, and live a life that seems to be devoid of anything transcendent, if we say, well, we can't live without it, we need something there, he says, the void seems to be devoid of objective things, it's empty. It's also taken as void of all spiritual relationships, distinctions of consciousness, qua consciousness. If we're going to think of it as a complete void, then what happens? Then we call it the Holy of Holies. We treat it with this utmost sort of respect, right? And people want to say, well, emptiness, or the unsayable, or the origin, or the end point, or something like that. And what's going to happen then? Human beings have a tendency not only to try to get in every door that's closed and to try to transgress limits, but also to project things into the places that they leave empty. So a void can't really stay a void. He's going to say what's going to happen here is they're going to fill it up with reveries. What are reveries? Daydreams, images, appearances, produced by consciousness itself. And Hegel would be willing to say that this is what goes on in most philosophies that establish this sort of limit and then say hands off over here, but this is vitally important. They end up shooting something in there and saying, well, that's what's there. But the problem with that is there's no real necessity. Not only have they sort of denied the appearances of things and the importance of those, because, guess what? Our connection with the inner world is going to be through appearances. They also take certain appearances on their own part, or certain imaginations, and then they shoot those in there and turn those into the transcendent. They turn those into the unconditioned universal that we've been looking for. So he says, here's how he concludes, it would have to be content with being treated so badly, for it would not deserve anything better, since even reveries are better than emptiness. It's interesting, isn't it, to see him talking about the void or the inner being of things as if it has its own sort of responsibility, its own sort of agency. It will indeed have that, because consciousness is, as we've pointed out, already over there. But consciousness has not realized that yet. The inner world, or supersensible beyond, has, however, come into being. It comes from the world of appearance, which has mediated it. In other words, appearance is its essence, and in fact, its filling. The supersensible is the sensuous and the perceived positing as it is in truth. But the truth of the sensuous and the perceived is to be appearance. The supersensible is therefore appearance qua appearance. We completely misunderstand this if we think that the supersensible world is therefore the sensuous world, or the world as it exists for immediate sense certainty and perception. For the world of appearance is, on the contrary, not the world of sense knowledge and perception as a world that positively is, but this world posited as superseded, or in truth an inner world. It is often said that the supersensible world is not appearance, but what is here understood by appearance is not appearance, but rather the sensuous world as itself the really actual. In 147, we arrive at a point where we probably need to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Hegel has just talked all about this supersensible world that is some sort of beyond for appearances, and yet it's going to be, as he's going to say, appearance as appearance, or the truth of appearance. So this should give us some pause and make us think for a bit, which is going to be very helpful as we approach the next couple paragraphs. What is really going on here with this supersensible world? As it's going to turn out, I'm going to give you a little bit of the foreshadowing. The supersensible world, like I said previously in one of the earlier paragraphs, is not supersensible in the way of being non-sensible, opposed to the sensible, totally cut off from it. Rather, it transcends it in a certain way. It opens up a kind of depth within the sensible that we were not yet capable of grasping through consciousness, but which implicitly we were already playing off of. So he says this inner world, or supersensible beyond, has come into being. Now, what the problem was is we didn't know what was there, right? Because we distinguished it from the world of appearance, which we understand, that's phenomenal. You know, we want to get around in the world of appearance. We look at things, we smell them, we taste them, we touch them, we experience them. But when it comes to this, you know, what ways do we have of opening it up and finding out what's inside? As it's going to turn out, the world of appearance is going to, if we understand it correctly, be revelatory of the supersensible world. It's not going to be something totally sundered from it. He says it comes from the world of appearance, which has mediated it. So when consciousness is trying to grasp the supersensible world, it necessarily is going to do so through the world of appearance. He says, in other words, appearance is actually its essence. Appearance is the essence of the thing that seems to go beyond appearance. He says the supersensible is the sensuous and the perceived, the things that we were studying in the last two sections. We're now seeing in force in the understanding the true senses, or the true meanings of sense certainty, what handled the sensuous, the immediate particular, located in space and time in our manifold of senses, and what is perceived, the thing that is grasped in its truth, in its Wahrheit. Wahrnehmen means perception, but also grasp or gripping of truth. So he says the supersensible world is indeed these, but as they are in truth. That means that there's a depth within everything that we're perceiving or sensing that we don't grasp just through sensitivity or sense perception, or through the perception through the universal, the sensuous universal. There's a beyond to every single particular, every single thing that we run into. Isn't that a fascinating thing to say? So he says, it's the sensuous and the perceived posited as it is in truth. What is the truth of the sensuous and the perceived? To be appearance, to be something that shows itself, that shines into our experience. So he says, the supersensible is appearance as appearance, appearance qua appearance, appearance as it is, something that we're going to explore then in greater detail. So he says, we completely misunderstand this if we think that the supersensible world is therefore the sensuous world, the world of appearance, right? They are different from each other, but they are not something totally separate from each other. You might say this is in a certain way the aspect of this, but really this is the aspect of this. There's a reciprocal relation of dependency there, as they are for consciousness. So he goes on and he says, it's not the sensuous world or the world as it exists for immediate sense certainty and perception. This world of appearance is grasped by the perceiving, by the sensitive human being, the person, right? But there's something more to consciousness than just that. He says, the world of appearance is, on the contrary, not the world of sense knowledge, and perception is a world that positively is, but a world posited as superseded. So what we've got going on here is the supersession, the raising to a higher level of Aufhebung. And what does that? It's going to be consciousness that actually does that, that behind the scenes has been operating. So he says, it's often said that the supersensible world is not an appearance, but what is here understood by appearance is not appearance. There is appearance in the sense of what is just there for sense certainty and perception, a lower level. And then there's appearance as it is for consciousness, consciousness that also includes the understanding and the faculty of reason. All of this is part of what a human being is. And it's not as if you can like separate them out. You know, we're gonna push a button and turn the reason on and turn the sense certainty off. It's not the way the human mind or the human soul or the human personality actually works. Instead, all of these function together, and we can, you know, move from one of these aspects to the other. So he says it's rather the sensuous world as itself the really actual. So the supersensible world is indeed the world of appearance, is indeed the world of the sensuous and perceived. It is the world that we experience, but experienced with a greater depth, precisely because of the cognitive aspects that we bring to it, that make it something in some ways more actual, more real, more dense in the meaning that's available to us.